The scent of baking bread is a cruel thing when you're starving. It wasn't a gentle aroma. It was a physical presence that hooked into my belly and twisted. For 3 days, I'd had nothing but muddy water and a handful of wild berries that left my tongue feeling like sandpaper. I was 14, but I felt 100. Every bone in my body was an aching reminder of its own existence. And there, sitting on the cooling rack in the open window of Miller's bakery, was a loaf of bread, golden brown, dusted with flour like a fresh snowfall. It seemed to pulse with warmth, a beacon of life in the dusty, tired street of Redemption Gulch. I watched from the shadows of the alley across the way, my stomach churning with a painful mix of hunger and fear. Stealing was a fast way to get acquainted with Sheriff Thompson's whip. Everyone knew that, but starving was a slower way to die. I had to choose. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. I took a shaky breath, the dust in the air catching in my throat. I waited for Miller to turn his back, his large, flour-dusted form moving toward the brick oven. It was now or never. My feet, wrapped in rags, made no sound as I darted across the street. My hand, thin and trembling, shot through the open window. The crust was still warm against my fingers. For a split second, a jolt of pure triumph shot through me. I had it. Then Miller's voice bellowed like a cannon. "Hey, thief!" My heart slammed against my ribs. I turned and ran, clutching the loaf to my chest like the most precious thing in the world. I didn't have a plan. I just ran. I could hear his heavy boots pounding the dirt behind me, his shouts raising the alarm. Faces turned to watch. Doors opened. The whole town was suddenly a witness to my crime. I was fast, but desperation doesn't outrun a town that's got nowhere else to look. I skidded around the corner of the general store and ran right into a wall of solid muscle. Sheriff Thompson. His hand clamped down on my shoulder, fingers digging in like steel talons. The bread tumbled from my grasp, landing in the dirt with a soft, heartbreaking thud. The chase was over. He hauled me back into the middle of the street, my feet dragging, the rough fabric of his shirt scratching my cheek. Miller came panting up, his face red with fury. "Caught him, Sheriff! Red-handed!" Sheriff Thompson smiled, a thin, unpleasant twisting of his lips. He enjoyed this part of his job. He held me up for the gathering crowd to see. A skinny, terrified boy who dared to steal a loaf of bread. "Well, well, what have we here?" he drawled, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Looks like young Leo has a lesson to learn about property. He didn't ask if I was hungry. He didn't ask why I did it. The law in Redemption Gulch was as simple and hard as the rocky ground it was built on." He looked at Miller, then at the crowd, his eyes glinting. "The penalty for thieving is clear." He dragged me toward the center of the town square, where a thick wooden post stood baked by the sun. It was stained dark in places. Everyone knew what those stains were. My blood ran cold. He pulled a length of rope from his belt and began tying my wrists to the post, pulling the knots brutally tight. 10 lashes, he declared, his voice ringing with authority. At sundown. Let it be a lesson to anyone else with sticky fingers. The crowd murmured. Some looked away, a few nodded in grim approval. I squeezed my eyes shut, my whole body trembling. Sundown. The word was a death sentence. As the sheriff walked away, leaving me tied there as a public spectacle, I opened my eyes and scanned the faces staring back at me. Pity, scorn, indifference. And then I saw him. Across the square, standing in the dark maw of the blacksmith's forge, was Elias. He was a mountain of a man, his arms thicker than my legs, his face perpetually covered in a mask of soot and grim concentration. He wasn't looking at me with pity or scorn. He wasn't looking at me at all. He was staring at Sheriff Thompson, his face as hard and unreadable as the iron on his anvil. And he said nothing. The sun was a merciless eye in the sky, beating down on my head. Hours crawled by. The townsfolk went about their business, occasionally glancing my way as if I were a new statue erected in the square, a monument to stupidity. My thirst was a fire in my throat, and the shame was even worse. Every whisper felt like a blow. Every stare was a judgment. I kept looking toward the forge. Elias was still there. He hadn't moved. He just worked. The rhythmic clang of his hammer on the anvil was the town's heartbeat. Clang, clang, clang. It was a steady, relentless sound that measured out the final minutes of my freedom from pain. Each strike seemed to be counting down to my punishment. Finally, the sun began to dip below the jagged line of the western mesas, painting the sky in brutal shades of orange and red. It was time. Sheriff Thompson emerged from his office, a coiled leather whip in his hand. He walked with a swagger, enjoying the theater of it all. The crowd, which had thinned during the heat of the day, began to gather again. They wanted to see the show. "All right, folks," the sheriff announced, his voice slick with satisfaction. "Time for this young thief to pay his debt." He stood behind me, and I could feel the heat radiating off his body. I tensed, my muscles knotting up, bracing for the first strike. I heard the sickening whistle as he swung the whip back. The sound cut through the air, sharp and final. I squeezed my eyes shut, a pathetic whimper escaping my lips. This was it. The leather would bite into my back, and my life, such as it was, would never be the same. The air cracked, but the pain didn't come. I held my breath, waiting. A confused murmur rippled through the crowd. I risked opening my eyes. Sheriff Thompson was frozen, his arm held high, the whip poised to strike. His eyes were locked on something in front of him. I twisted my head, the ropes biting into my wrists. Elias the blacksmith had taken a single step out of his forge. That was all. One step. He was standing in the fading sunlight, his massive frame casting a long shadow that reached all the way to the whipping post. He hadn't said a word. He didn't need to. His eyes, dark and intense, were fixed on the sheriff. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement. The relentless clang of the hammer had stopped. The silence that filled the square was heavier and more terrifying than any sound I had ever heard. It stretched for what felt like an eternity. The sheriff, a man who fed on fear, looked afraid. His swagger was gone, replaced by a nervous twitch in his cheek. Elias still said nothing. He simply reached into a leather pouch at his belt and pulled out a coin. It was a big silver dollar. He held it up between his thumb and forefinger, letting it catch the last rays of the dying sun. The glint of silver seemed to cut through the tension. He held it out. An offering. A payment. A demand. The sheriff's face went from pale to a deep, blotchy red. He was being challenged, and not with words or weapons, but with silence and a single coin. It was a public humiliation. He looked from the coin to Elias's unyielding face, then to the eager eyes of the crowd. He was trapped. To whip me now would be to defy the blacksmith, a man no one in their right mind wanted to cross. To accept the coin would be to admit defeat. He chose defeat. With a growl of frustration, he lowered the whip. He stomped over to Elias and snatched the coin from his hand, his movements jerky and angry. "Fine," he spat, his voice low and venomous. "The boy's debt is paid. He's your problem now." Elias didn't even glance at him. He walked past the fuming sheriff, his heavy boots kicking up little puffs of dust. He stopped in front of me. He pulled a wicked-looking knife from his belt, and for a terrifying second, I thought he was going to finish the sheriff's job. Instead, he sliced through the ropes on my wrists with a single, clean motion. The ropes fell away. I stumbled forward, my arms numb and tingling. I looked up at him, my mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. What did he want? Why had he done this? He didn't offer a word of explanation. He just looked down at me, his face a stony mask, and jerked his head once toward the forge. It was a clear, unspoken command. "Follow me." Terrified and utterly bewildered, I did. I scrambled after his retreating form, leaving the stunned crowd and the humiliated sheriff behind. The walk across the square was the longest of my life. I didn't dare look back. I just kept my eyes on the blacksmith's broad back, wondering what kind of hell I had just been saved for. The inside of the forge was like stepping into the belly of a beast. The air was thick with the smell of coal smoke, hot metal, and sweat. It was a cave of shadows and firelight, where tools I couldn't name hung from the walls like instruments of torture. The great anvil stood in the center, squat and solid, its surface scarred from 1,000 violent encounters. The heat from the furnace washed over me, a physical blow that made my head swim. Elias paid me no mind. He walked to the massive bellows and gave the handle a few powerful pumps. The embers in the furnace roared to life, casting dancing, demonic shadows on the walls. He picked up a pair of long tongs, selected a glowing piece of iron from the fire, and laid it on the anvil. Then the hammering began again. Clang, clang, clang. The sound was deafening up close. It vibrated through the floor, up my legs, and into my teeth. He worked with a brutal, focused grace, his muscles coiling and uncoiling under his sweat-slick skin. Sparks flew with every strike, a shower of miniature stars that died in the gloom. He was shaping the iron, bending it to his will, with nothing but fire and force. I just stood there, small and useless, my stomach growling. He hadn't said a word to me since we'd entered. He hadn't even looked at me. Was this a punishment? Was he just going to let me stand here and bake until I passed out? After what felt like an hour, he plunged the glowing metal into a barrel of water. A violent hiss filled the air as a cloud of steam erupted, smelling sharp and metallic. He set the finished piece, a heavy-duty hinge, on a workbench. He finally turned to me. His eyes, barely visible in the dim light, seemed to pierce right through me. He pointed a calloused, soot-stained finger toward a massive pile of scrap metal in the corner. There were broken tools, bent horseshoes, old chains, and rusted bits of machinery. "Sort it," he said. His voice was a low rumble, like rocks grinding together. It was the first time he had spoken more than a single word to me. "Sort it how?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He gave me a look that made me feel like an idiot. "Iron here," he said, pointing to one empty space. "Steel there." He gestured to another. "Useless slag in the bucket." With that, he turned his back on me and went back to the furnace. The conversation was over. I had my orders. It was a mountain of metal. It would take days, maybe weeks. My hands were soft, my arms were weak from hunger. But I had been saved from the whip. For now, this was my penance. I picked up the first piece, a twisted piece of rebar. It was heavy and coated in rust that came off on my hands like dried blood. My back ached. My head pounded from the heat and the constant, rhythmic hammering. But as I worked, a single question echoed in my mind with every clang of Elias's hammer. Why? Why save a boy who stole bread, only to put him to work like a slave? What did this silent, terrifying man want from me? The days bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of the sun outside the ever-open doors of the forge. My life became a simple, brutal rhythm. Wake up on a bed of straw in the corner. Sort scrap until my hands were raw. Eat the slab of bread and cheese he left on the workbench. Sleep. And through it all, the constant, thunderous symphony of the hammer. Elias barely spoke. He was a creature of fire and iron. Our communication was a series of grunts, gestures, and the occasional one-word command. Bellows. Quench. Hammer. I learned to anticipate his needs, to read the slight shift in his shoulders or the way he held a piece of metal in the fire. I learned that a steady, rhythmic hammering meant the steel was shaping well. A series of fast, angry strikes meant an impurity had been found. He was a harsh master, but he wasn't cruel. The food he gave me was plain, but it was always there. One evening, when a cold wind howled through the town, I woke up to find a thick wool blanket draped over me. I never saw him put it there. He demanded work, but he provided for my survival. It was a strange, silent contract I didn't understand. One afternoon, while clearing out a dusty crate of old tools, my fingers brushed against something smooth and cool. It wasn't metal. I pulled it out. It was a small bird, carved from a single piece of pale wood. It was exquisitely detailed, every feather etched with care, its head cocked as if listening to a song. It was so delicate, so full of life. It felt completely out of place in this world of brute force and black iron. I held it in the palm of my hand, marveling at the craftsmanship. Who would make something like this? It seemed to hold a quiet sadness. A shadow fell over me. I looked up. Elias was standing there, his face unreadable. His eyes were fixed on the wooden bird in my hand. He didn't say anything. He just reached down and plucked it from my palm, his large calloused fingers surprisingly gentle. He stared at it for a long moment, and I saw something flicker in his eyes. It was a deep, raw emotion that I had never seen on his face before. It looked like pain. He closed his fist around the bird, turned without a word, and walked to a small, locked chest in the far corner of the forge. He unlocked it, placed the bird inside, and locked it again. Then he went back to his anvil as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. I had seen a crack in the iron wall he had built around himself. This silent, formidable man had a secret, and for some reason it was shaped like a small wooden bird. The mystery of him only deepened, and my fear began to slowly curdle into a strange kind of curiosity. Life in the forge settled into a predictable pattern. I graduated from sorting scrap to working the bellows, learning to feed the fire just enough air to get the perfect heat. Elias taught me how to tell the temperature of the metal by its color, from a dull red to a brilliant, almost white-hot glow. He was still a man of few words, but his silence was becoming less menacing. It was just him. One morning, a shadow fell across the forge entrance, blocking the morning light. A man on a fine-looking horse had stopped outside. He was dressed in expensive clothes, his boots polished to a high shine. This was Mr. Silas Croft, the wealthiest rancher in the territory. He owned the vast plains to the east, and his brand, a stylized C, was on hundreds of head of cattle. He dismounted and strode into the forge like he owned it. He had a pinched, arrogant face and eyes that seemed to constantly be calculating the worth of everything and everyone they landed on. "Blacksmith," Croft said, his voice dripping with condescension. He didn't use Elias's name. "I need a new branding iron. The old one's warped, and I need it by tomorrow." Elias, who was hammering a horseshoe, finished the piece with a few precise taps before looking up. He wiped a trickle of sweat from his brow with the back of his arm, leaving a black smear. He simply nodded. Croft's eyes swept the forge, a look of distaste on his face. "They landed on me," he sneered. "Still collecting stray dogs, I see." He looked me up and down. "Isn't that the little bread thief? I'm surprised Thompson let you buy him off. Some vermin just need to be put down." I flinched, the shame of that day washing over me again. I expected Elias to ignore the comment, to retreat into his usual stony silence. But he didn't. He didn't say a word, but his grip on the heavy forging hammer tightened. His knuckles went white under the soot. His jaw muscle bunched, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. It was the first time I had ever seen him react to anyone with anything that looked like anger. A quiet, contained, but terrifyingly potent anger. Croft either didn't notice or didn't care. "Just have it ready by morning," he ordered, tossing a coin onto the anvil. It rang with a sharp, clear sound. He turned and left, leaving a void where his arrogance had been. Elias stood there for a long moment, staring at the door Croft had exited through. Then, with a deliberate motion, he picked up the coin and dropped it into a bucket of water. It hissed, the sound full of contempt. He then picked up a fresh bar of steel and thrust it into the heart of the fire. He was going to make Croft's brand, but the look on his face told me he was forging more than just metal. He was forging his hatred. Elias worked on the branding iron with a frightening intensity. The hammer fell faster, harder than I'd ever heard it. Sparks flew like angry hornets. He was pouring all of his silent rage into the steel, shaping Croft's initial into a cruel, sharp-edged spur. He didn't stop, not for water, not to rest. The forge became an oven, and the rhythmic clang of his hammer was the only sound in the world. As he was finishing the main design, he did something strange. He glanced out the door, checking to make sure no one was watching. The street was quiet. He then took a small, square piece of scrap steel, heated it until it glowed a cherry red, and placed it on the anvil. With a smaller, more precise hammer, he began to tap at the metal. He wasn't making a tool or a part. He was creating an image. In less than a minute, it was done. He quenched it quickly. I caught a glimpse of the design just before the steam obscured it. It was a bird, a simple, elegant outline of a bird in flight. It was the same shape as the wooden carving he kept locked in his chest. He looked at the small metal token, his expression unreadable, then slipped it into his pocket. He then went back to finishing Croft's branding iron, his face once again a stoic mask. What did it mean? Was it a signature? A secret mark? The blacksmith was a man of layers, and I was only just beginning to see how deep they went. He was building a puzzle right in front of me, and I didn't have any of the right pieces. The next morning, the branding iron was finished. It was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, perfectly balanced, the sea sharp and clear. But knowing the silent fury that had gone into its creation, it looked sinister to me now. A weapon forged from pure hate. Elias wrapped it in a piece of burlap. "Stay here," he grunted and headed out. I watched him walk down the dusty street toward Croft's local office. He walked with a stiff, rigid posture, like a man marching into a battle he knew he couldn't win, but had to fight anyway. He was gone for less than 20 minutes. When he returned, his face was even harder than before, if that were possible. He walked past me, went to his workbench, and slammed the payment, a handful of coins, down on the wood. The coins rattled and spun, the sound sharp and angry in the quiet forge. He then walked to the forge door and stood there, staring out. I followed his gaze. He wasn't looking at the town. He was looking past it, to the vast plains to the east, where the Silas Croft Ranch spread out like a conquering empire. He stood there for a long time, unmoving, a storm of unspoken thoughts raging behind his eyes. I was beginning to understand. His silence wasn't emptiness. It was full. It was packed with a history I couldn't fathom, a pain I couldn't comprehend, and a deep, abiding hatred for one man, Silas Croft. Saving me hadn't been a random act of kindness. I was a piece in a game I didn't know I was playing, and I had a terrible feeling that the game was about to become very, very dangerous. That night, the forge was cold. For the first time, Elias didn't bank the fire. He let it die down to pale, gray ashes. The life of the workshop seemed to go out with it. I lay on my straw bed, the wool blanket pulled up to my chin. But the chill I felt had nothing to do with the temperature. It was a coldness radiating from the man in the corner. Sleep wouldn't come. The silence was too loud. The familiar clang of the hammer had been replaced by a heavy, oppressive stillness. Sometime after midnight, I heard a sound, a soft scraping noise. I sat up, my heart pounding. It was Elias. He was hunched over the small wooden chest in the corner, the one he kept locked. It was open. In the faint moonlight filtering through the dusty windows, I could see him holding the small wooden bird. His shoulders were shaking. It was a quiet, subtle movement, but it was unmistakable. He wasn't sobbing. No sound escaped his lips, but his whole massive frame was trembling with a grief so profound it seemed to suck the very air out of the room. He was a mountain, and I was watching that mountain crumble from the inside out. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing. This was a private moment, a sacred wound I had no right to witness. I sank back down into my straw bed, my mind reeling. The blacksmith, the fearsome, silent man who could bend steel with his bare hands, was utterly and completely broken. His silence wasn't a choice. It wasn't a personality quirk. It was a cage he had built around an unspeakable sorrow. The anger he held for Croft, the strange kindness he had shown me, the symbol of the bird. It was all connected. I knew then, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that whatever Silas Croft had done to this man, it was something far worse than a simple business dispute. It was something that had shattered his soul. And I, the boy he'd saved from the whip, was now standing right in the middle of the wreckage. A few days later, a traveling merchant's wagon rattled into town. It was a rare event, and it drew a crowd to the general store. The merchant was a talkative man, full of news and gossip from the wider world. While Elias sent me to fetch some supplies, a rare trip out of the forge, I saw the merchant talking to Sheriff Thompson on the porch of his office. I tried not to be obvious, lingering near a barrel of pickles, pretending to inspect them. "Looking for a fellow?" the merchant was saying. "Goes by the name of Elias Thorne. Owed me a hefty sum. Blacksmith by trade, but not a very good one. Truth be told. Had a small holding up north. Lost it all." My blood went cold. Elias Thorne. The sheriff grunted. "Our blacksmith's name is Elias. Just Elias. Big fella. Keeps to himself. Been here about 5 years. "That'd be the time," the merchant mused. "Heard he had some kind of trouble. A fire, I think. Terrible business. He just vanished after that. Left a mountain of debt behind." The merchant lowered his voice. "They say he lost everything. His wife, his kid, everything." I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. I dropped the bag of nails I was holding, the clatter making both men look over at me. I mumbled an apology, quickly paid for my things, and hurried back to the forge, my mind racing. Elias wasn't from here. He'd had another life, a family, a fire. I thought about the pain in his eyes when he held that wooden bird. A kid. He'd lost a child. The pieces were beginning to slot together, and the picture they were forming was horrifying. I started asking quiet questions around town, picking up scraps of information. Elias had arrived in Redemption Gulch 5 years ago, a ghost of a man with nothing but the clothes on his back. He bought the old, dilapidated forge for a pittance and slowly brought it back to life. And Silas Croft? He'd arrived a few months earlier, flush with cash. He'd bought the old Miller Ranch and quickly expanded, buying out smaller homesteaders, often for prices that were suspiciously low. He built his empire at the same time Elias was building his forge. They had arrived in the same place, at the same time, from opposite ends of fortune. It wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. The weight of it all pressed down on me. I felt like I was holding a live grenade, and I didn't know how to put it down. The silence in the forge was no longer just quiet. It was filled with unspoken tragedy. Every strike of the hammer sounded like a cry of rage. That evening, I couldn't take it anymore. The unspoken questions were a poison in my gut. As Elias stood staring into the dying embers of the furnace, his back to me, I found a sliver of courage. My voice was a dry croak. Elias! He didn't turn. The bird! I pushed on, my heart hammering. The carving! What was it for? For a long time, he said nothing. I thought he was going to ignore me, to retreat back behind his wall of silence. I was about to give up, to shrink back into my corner, when he finally spoke. His voice was a raw, broken whisper, a sound I had never heard before. It was the sound of a wound being torn open. It was my son's. The three words hung in the hot, smoky air. They were heavier than any anvil, sharper than any blade. My son's. He had a son. He was gone. He carved them, Elias continued, his voice still a low rasp, speaking to the fire instead of me. Samuel, that was his name. He could make a block of wood look like it was about to take flight. He loved birds, said they were the only creatures that were truly free. He fell silent again, and I could feel the immense effort it was taking him to speak. He was unburdening himself of a story he had carried alone for 5 long years. We had a farm, north of here. It wasn't much, but it was ours. My wife, Sarah, she could make anything grow. We were happy. He finally turned to look at me, and his eyes were hollowed out pits of grief. We weren't rich. We hit a bad season, needed a loan to buy seed for the spring. We went to a moneylender in the next town over, a man who smiled while he put the noose around your neck. He didn't have to say the name. I already knew. Silas Croft, I whispered. Elias nodded slowly, a grim, final confirmation. He gave us the loan. The terms were steep, but we thought we could make it. Then the rains failed. The crop withered. We couldn't pay. Croft showed up one day with a deed and 2 hired men. Said the farm was his. He took a ragged breath, the memory clearly agonizing. It was the middle of winter, snow on the ground. He told us to be out by nightfall. Sarah, she begged him for more time, just a few days. He laughed. He told his men to start moving our things out onto the road. His voice dropped so low I could barely hear it. I tried to stop them. I told him he couldn't just throw us out in the cold. We fought. One of his men knocked over an oil lamp. It was so fast. The old farmhouse was dry as tinder. It went up like a torch. He looked away, his gaze distant, seeing a horror I could only imagine. The smoke, the fire. I got out. I tried to go back in for them. The roof came down. Sarah and Samuel. They were inside. The forge was dead silent. Even the crickets outside seemed to have stopped their chirping. The story was a physical thing, a crushing weight in the air between us. Silas Croft hadn't just foreclosed on a loan. He had burned Elias's world to the ground. He was a murderer. I woke up days later in a stranger's barn, Elias finished, his voice devoid of all emotion. They were gone. The farm was gone. Croft was gone. I heard he'd come into some money and moved south to start a ranching empire. So I followed. He looked at his hands, calloused and scarred from the forge. I came here. I saw him living like a king on the life he stole from me. I took up the hammer. Every day I beat my grief and my rage into the steel. I've been waiting, biding my time, learning to be patient. Now I understood everything. The silence was his penance. The forge was his sanctuary. The hammer was his weapon. And his hatred for Croft wasn't just anger. It was a promise. A vow of vengeance forged in the fires of an unimaginable loss. He then looked directly at me, and for the first time, I saw not just a blacksmith, but the man he used to be, a father, a husband. I saw you that day, tied to the post, he said, his voice regaining some of its strength. I saw the hunger and the desperation in your eyes. I saw a boy who was being crushed by a world that didn't care. I saw myself all those years ago, and I saw Croft in the sheriff, a man using his power to break someone smaller than him. He had saved me because, in a way, he was trying to save the boy he used to be, the man who had lost everything. He was fighting a proxy war against the injustice that had ruined him. Croft can't be beaten with a hammer, Elias said, his voice turning hard as iron. He's too powerful. His whole empire is built on a foundation of lies and broken people. But a foundation can be cracked. You just need to know where to strike. He walked over to a loose stone in the floor near the furnace. He pried it up. Beneath it was a hollow space. He reached inside and pulled out a thick, leather-bound ledger. He placed it on the anvil with a heavy thud. For 5 years I've listened, he said, opening the book. I've watched. Every time Croft cheated a farmer, every time he threatened a homesteader, every time he bribed an official, I wrote it down. The pages were filled with his neat, blocky script. Names, dates, amounts. It was a meticulous record of Silas Croft's reign of terror. It was damning, but it was just one man's word against another's. It's not enough, I said, realizing the problem. It's your word against his. I know, Elias said, his eyes glinting in the firelight. I'm missing one final piece. The proof, the real ledgers, the forged deeds. He's too smart to leave them lying around. He keeps them in a safe in his study at the ranch. I've heard the servants talk. A crazy, terrifying idea began to form in the space between us. An idea so reckless, it made my blood run cold. No one can get near that ranch house, I said. It's guarded day and night. Not if there's a distraction, Elias countered, his gaze intense. Not if someone small and fast could slip in while everyone is looking the other way. He wasn't asking. He was stating a fact. He was looking at me, and I knew what he was thinking. He had saved my life. He had given me food and shelter. He had told me his deepest, most painful secret. We were bound together now by more than just circumstance. My fear was a living thing in my chest. But my loyalty to this broken, powerful man was stronger. He had stood up for me when no one else would. Now it was my turn. What's the plan? I asked. A week later, the plan was set. Croft was throwing a large party at his ranch, a celebration of some new land acquisition. Land he'd likely bullied some poor family into selling. Ranchers and businessmen from 3 territories would be there. The house would be full of people, the guards would be distracted, and Croft himself would be busy playing the part of the generous host. It was the perfect opportunity. The plan was simple, which also meant it was incredibly stupid. Elias would create a diversion, a big one. At the far end of Croft's property, near the dry canyons, was a storage barn full of old hay. A fire there would draw every available ranch hand away from the main house. In the ensuing chaos, I was to slip in through a kitchen window that Elias knew from his intelligence gathering had a faulty latch. My job was to get to the study, find the safe, and retrieve the ledgers. The risk was enormous. If I was caught, Croft wouldn't hand me over to the sheriff for a whipping. He would hang me from the nearest tree and call it justice. The night of the party, the air was tense. Elias and I worked in the forge, but not on any real project. It was just to keep up appearances. He gave me a final rundown. The study is on the ground floor, west wing. he said, his voice low and steady. The safe is behind a large painting of a ship in a storm. I don't know how to open it. You'll have to find a key or the combination. Look on his desk, in his drawers. Be quick. He placed a hand on my shoulder. His grip was firm, grounding. Leo, he said, using my name for what felt like the first time. You don't have to do this. This is my fight. You made it my fight when you cut those ropes, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. He would have beaten me for a loaf of bread. God knows what he'd do to you if he found out what you know. Let's finish this. He nodded once, a flicker of something that might have been pride in his eyes. As darkness fell, we set out. He rode his sturdy workhorse, and I rode a small pony he'd borrowed. We skirted the town and came at the Croft Ranch from the desolate, rocky south. The ranch house was a blaze of light in the distance, music faintly drifting on the wind. It looked like a different world. We reached the canyons. Elias dismounted. It will take them 20 minutes to get here from the house, he said, pulling out a small tinderbox. And 20 minutes to get back. You have a 40-minute window. No more. Get the books and get out. Meet me back at the Crooked Oak by the creek. He looked at me one last time. Be safe, son. He called me son. He lit a torch, rode toward the barn, and a few minutes later the sky to the north lit up with an angry orange glow. I could hear faint, distant shouts. The diversion had begun. It was my turn. I urged the pony forward, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I rode hard, keeping low, using the hills and shadows for cover. The chaos at the ranch was exactly as Elias had predicted. Men were shouting, grabbing buckets, and riding hell for leather toward the fire. The party guests were spilling out onto the verandas, pointing at the distant glow. I tethered the pony in a thicket of trees and crept toward the house. The kitchen was pandemonium, with staff running in and out. I found the window with the faulty latch, just as he'd said. I slipped it open and slid inside, landing silently behind a large stack of flour sacks. The house was opulent, a palace of polished wood and expensive fabrics. The contrast with the grit and soot of the forge was jarring. I moved like a shadow down the hallway, my ragged clothes and bare feet completely out of place. I could hear the murmur of the party guests in the main hall, their laughter and chatter sounding alien and carefree. I found the west wing. A heavy oak door stood slightly ajar. The study. I slipped inside and closed it behind me, my heart in my throat. The room was just as Elias had described. A massive desk, shelves lined with books, and on the far wall, a large, dark painting of a ship being tossed on a stormy sea. I hurried over and lifted it. It swung away from the wall on a hinge, revealing the black iron door of a safe. It was locked. Of course, it was locked. I scrambled over to the desk, my hands shaking. I pulled open the drawers. Papers, contracts, pens. Nothing. I checked under the blotter. Nothing. Where would a man like Croft hide the key to all his secrets? It had to be somewhere close. Somewhere clever. Then I heard them. Footsteps. Heavy, confident footsteps coming down the hall. They were heading directly for the study. I froze, my blood turning to ice. I was trapped. There was nowhere to hide. The door handle began to turn. This was it. I was a dead man. The door swung open. It wasn't Silas Croft. It was Sheriff Thompson. He stood in the doorway, his hand on his gun belt. He didn't look surprised or angry. He just looked tired. He closed the door behind him, his eyes finding me in the dim light. My whole body went rigid, expecting him to shout, to draw his weapon. Instead, he spoke in a low, conspiratorial voice. Looking for this? He held up his hand. Dangling from his finger was a small, ornate brass key. The key to the safe. I stared at him, my mind unable to process what was happening. Why wasn't he arresting me? Why was he helping me? The sheriff sighed, a weary sound. I've known about Croft for years, he said, walking over to the safe. Known what a snake he is. But he had his hooks in everyone, including me. A few bad debts from my past. He held them over my head. I couldn't make a move against him, not without ironclad proof that would stick. He put the key in the lock. I've been waiting for someone with enough grit to push back, someone who wouldn't just roll over. He paused and looked at me, a glimmer of respect in his eyes. That blacksmith, Elias, he's a patient man. When he stepped up for you in the square that day, he wasn't just buying off your sentence. He was sending me a message. My mind flashed back to that moment. Elias holding out the single silver dollar, the sheriff snatching it. The coin wasn't a bribe, Thompson explained, turning the key. It was a signal, a prearranged signal we set up years ago, in case one of us ever found a way to move against Croft. Elias was telling me he was ready. He was telling me he had a plan, and he was trusting me to do the right thing when the time came. The heavy door of the safe swung open with a low groan. It was all there. Stacks of papers, ledgers with neat columns of figures that documented his extortion, forged deeds with fake signatures, and on the very top, a bundle of yellowed letters tied with a ribbon. The sheriff picked up the top letter. "This," he said, his voice grim, "is what I was really waiting for." He read from it. "The fire was an accident, I swear, but it solved our problem with the farmer Thorne. He'll have no claim now. Keep this as insurance that I'll keep my end of the bargain." It was a confession, a letter from Croft to the partner who had helped him secure the land, the final, undeniable piece of the puzzle, the proof that Elias had waited 5 years to find. "He's a monster," I breathed. "Yes," the sheriff said, gathering the documents. "He is, and his reign is over." Just then, the study door creaked open again. Silas Croft stood there, a glass of whiskey in his hand, a self-satisfied smirk on his face. The smirk vanished as he saw us. His eyes darted from me to the sheriff, to the open safe and the papers in Thompson's hands. The color drained from his face, leaving it a sickly, pale white. "Thompson? What is the meaning of this?" he sputtered, his voice a mixture of shock and fury. "And you little thief!" He lunged for me, his face contorted in a mask of rage. "That's far enough, Croft." A new voice filled the room, a low, rumbling voice that carried the weight of 5 years of pain and patience. Elias stepped out of the shadows behind the sheriff. He must have followed me, a silent guardian angel made of soot and iron. He wasn't holding a hammer. He didn't need one. He just stood there, his immense presence filling the room, his eyes locked on the man who had destroyed his life. Croft froze, his eyes wide with a dawning horror. He was looking at a ghost. "Thorne," he whispered, the name a curse on his lips. "You're supposed to be—" "I am," Elias said, his voice flat and cold. "But some things don't stay buried." The sheriff stepped forward, the papers held firmly in his hand. "Silas Croft," he said, his voice ringing with a newfound authority he hadn't possessed in years. "You are under arrest for fraud, extortion, and for the murder of Sarah and Samuel Thorne." Croft let out a choked, desperate sound. He looked from Elias's stony face to the sheriff's determined one. He was trapped. The empire he had built on ashes was about to be consumed by fire. Justice, like the metal on Elias's anvil, had finally taken shape. The town of Redemption Gulch was never the same. When the news of Croft's crimes came out, it was like a dam breaking. One by one, farmers and ranchers he had cheated came forward with their own stories, their testimony adding to the mountain of evidence against him. His empire crumbled in a matter of weeks. The land was seized, and a territorial judge spent the next few months sorting out the rightful claims, returning property to the families Croft had ruined. The shadow that had hung over the town for 5 years was finally gone. You could feel it in the air. People walked a little taller. They spoke a little louder. The whole town breathed a collective sigh of relief. Sheriff Thompson became a different man. Freed from Croft's blackmail, he stood as a genuine keeper of the peace, respected instead of feared. And Elias, he was no longer just the silent, intimidating blacksmith. He was the man who had patiently, quietly brought down a tyrant. He was a hero, but he didn't act like one. He just went back to his forge. The day after Croft's arrest, Elias and I stood before the furnace. He took the branding iron he had made, the cruel seed that had been a symbol of so much pain, and thrust it into the heart of the fire. He heated it until it glowed white-hot, all its sharpness and identity lost to the heat. Then he laid it on the anvil and with a few powerful blows of his hammer, flattened it into an unrecognizable lump of steel. He was erasing the past. He then took out the small metal bird he had forged in secret. He drilled a small hole in it and hung it from a nail on the beam directly above the anvil. It spun slowly in the heat currents, a small, hopeful silhouette against the firelight. "This is a place where we build things now," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Not break them." He turned to me. The grief was still in his eyes. It would always be there, but it was joined by something else now, a kind of peace, a new beginning. "I need a partner," he said. "Not an apprentice. A partner, if you'll have the job." He held out his hand. It was scarred, calloused, and covered in soot. I looked at my own hands, which were no longer soft. They were tough now, with the beginnings of calluses from sorting scrap and working the bellows. I had come to this forge a starving thief, a boy with no future. I was leaving it as something more. I took his hand and shook it. His grip was like iron, but for the first time, it felt like a promise, not a threat. "I'd like that," I said. My life changed that day I was caught stealing bread. What should have been the worst day of my life turned out to be the most important. I learned that justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's forged in silence, with patience and fire. I learned that the strongest men aren't the ones who shout the loudest, but the ones who can bear an impossible weight and still find the strength to build something new. Elias taught me how to shape steel, but he also taught me how to shape a life. We worked side by side for years, the clang of our hammers becoming a familiar, hopeful song in Redemption Gulch, the song of two broken people who had found a home, a purpose, and a family in the heart of a fiery forge. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe.